My name is Amanda, and I'm a student at the business school. And I came to grad school with an interest in energy storage for grid resiliency specifically. And that's how I came to be an intern at both Form Energy and Natron Energy. And they are companies that are making batteries that don't use lithium. And one of the use cases for the Natron Energy battery is actually in EV charging stations. So if multiple cars go up to a charging station, they can all use their fast charge capability without putting too much strain on the grid. And so that leads me to my capstone topic, which is called Beyond Charging Stations. And it's basically going to be a highlight reel of everything else that we need to consider for the EV transition besides more charging stations. And so, quick overview, I'll talk a little bit about why this is an important problem, talk about what I did and what I found, and then some potential risks to the EV transition, and then wrap up from there. So, level set, climate change is happening, it's bad. Greenhouse gas emissions warm the planet. We want to limit greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible. And so when we look at GHG emissions in the United States, a big chunk of it comes from transportation. And so in line with the White House's net zero 2050 goals, a lot of money is being thrown at decarbonizing transportation. And the way that we're trying to do that is by electrifying it. So you've got billions of dollars from state and federal government to specifically build out EV charging infrastructure. And that's great, and we're moving in the right direction until you realize that the average utilization rate of a public charging station in California hovers around 5%. And so why should we be putting all this money into building more if we're not even using the ones we have? And so this signaled to me that there's a lot that we haven't considered in what we need to take care of in terms of making sure that the EV transition happens in a timely manner. So just to drive the point home, effective spending for the EV transition should do more than just build charging stations. Specifically, it should foster development across these 4 areas that I'll talk more about later. But just as an aside, my deliverable for this capstone project is a succinct briefing based on these 4 areas that will eventually be delivered to the Senate Committee on Energy and Resources, just as kind of like a baseline understanding background reading material for some future hearing about the EV transition. So quickly, methods. I tried to organize all of the things that I thought would be important into these 4 categories, and then did a literature review to just kind of understand what the scale of the interventions needed would be, and understand like what's happened in other countries as well. And then supplemented this with some structured interviews with folks across industry and academia to just make sure that I was thinking about the problem in a reasonable way and that I truly was building a holistic picture of what needs to happen. And so, analysis and outcomes. The first category of things that I thought about was electricity production and delivery. So I was concerned about whether we could actually produce the sheer quantity of energy needed to move all these cars in a future where we are not using gasoline anymore. And the short answer is yes. The electricity grid has supported spikes in demand like this before, but we've always used fossil fuels. And so in a future where we're not using fossil fuels anymore, we will need to shore up today energy storage to make sure that when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we still have electricity to use and power our vehicles. And the second category is specific to EV charging. So it makes sense, it works, we can plug in, cars can charge, but how do we make sure that we can do it at scale? There are a couple of system changes that are needed. So in addition to building more charging stations, we also need to build out pretty extensive non-physical infrastructure. So there's the idea of demand management, being able to coordinate who gets to charge when. If everyone goes home at night and plugs in their cars at the same time, that's a lot of bad things are going to happen to the grid. There's also infrastructure around data collection that needs to happen. So a big stipulation in receiving this funding for electric vehicle charging station build out is that you have to prove 97% uptime. So over the course of 12 months, my charging station was operational for 97% of the year. That type of reporting is really hard to do and complicated, so we need to figure out how that works too. And then finally, the market is really fragmented. Today, there are about 30 separate EV charging station networks across the country, and it's really hard to move in between them. So you can't just walk up to a different company's charging station with your credit card. You have to make an account and upload a prepaid balance, and it's a really complicated thing. And then driver behavior. So driving an electric vehicle is really different from driving an internal combustion vehicle. So specifically when it comes to fueling. Today, if you drive a gas-powered vehicle, you're probably driving until the tank's maybe 10-20% full, and then going to a gas station. Due to the time constraints of electric vehicle charging, you can't do that as quickly. Most cars on the market today can't accept a fast charge, so you kind of have to adapt and be willing to continuously top up at a charging station at the grocery store or at school. And that kind of behavior change is going to be really hard to come by. There's also some concern around rebound effects. So maybe once people have electric vehicles and have a clean mode of transportation, you start to travel more than you normally would. Early studies show that this is not too much of a concern, so we don't quite need some interventions yet. But in general, behavior change is hard. So if you look at other studies that try to induce sustainable behaviors like composting or biking to work, even among people who are on board with saving the planet, you only get about 5% of people who will actually commit to that change. So maybe for this category, you might have to let sleeping dogs lie. And then finally, legacy considerations. What are the people and things that will be left behind as a result of the EV transition? So today, there are over 2.5 million miles of pipeline in the United States. And just as an example for the scale of cost, in Minnesota, decommissioning, just abandoning in place about 1,000 miles of pipeline will cost $86 million. And actually removing it will cost closer to $1.2 billion. And of course, costs will vary depending on what the pipeline is and where it is, but that's just kind of the scale of what we're dealing with. There's also gas stations, so 110,000 of them across the US today. Hopefully those can just be repurposed into charging stations, and you can still, go into the convenience store and get your snacks and all that stuff. And then thirdly, labor. So as Hannes and Kyle told us about earlier, we'll need to do a lot of reskilling. Ford, Stellantis, a lot of other auto manufacturers have already laid off thousands of employees in the name of this shift towards focusing on building electric vehicles. And in 2019, the EU had already started this big campaign to reskill and upskill close to 800,000 employees in battery manufacturing because of this industry shift. And so if the US is serious about wanting a domestic supply chain, this has to be part of the federal spending budget as well. And so quickly, risk transition, execution risk. It's really complicated to get stuff for batteries and then get the batteries into cars and get the cars to the US. So there's just a risk in actually getting the sheer number of electric vehicles that we'll need in order to make the transition in time. And then strategy risk. There's a chance that maybe electric vehicles aren't the way we should decarbonize transportation, and perhaps Toyota's dreams of having hydrogen fuel cells pave the way could come true. And so to conclude, more charging stations is just one of many steps towards a successful EV transition. We'll need policy and funding to shore up everything from energy storage to both physical and non-physical infrastructure for EV charging, education for drivers. One thing that I meant to mention, but I didn't because I sent my slides to Clark too early, was that electric vehicles are a lot heavier. So for reference, GMC Hummer, 6,000 pounds, but the electric version weighs 9,000 pounds. And for every additional 1,000 pounds of weight that you add, you increase the chance of death in an accident by almost 50%. So we need to consider regulations around either manufacturing safety or driver's licensing safety. And then finally, legacy impacts, making sure that we're taking care of the people and things that we'll leave behind. Thank you.
So you mentioned that the grid has capacity. but I've also recently came to my attention that there's actually it's very hard to get permits in San Francisco, and they're making it even harder to get electric charging permits.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true in Fremont. So California, in general, is seeing that they're having a problem with the speed of the electric transition. It turns out VCs weren't right necessarily. They didn't foresee this. Did you do any research, or did you come? Do you have any information on the speed of that?
I didn't really think about speed because this was all just kind of looking at what needs to happen by 2030 and like assumed that we would electrify everything by 2050. But yeah, I think that's a great point. We've been able to handle everything so far because the speed has been slow, and we still have the flexibility of electricity from fossil fuels as well. And so, yeah, so maybe it's a good thing that it's a little slower because we wouldn't be able to necessarily put out the infrastructure to support all of those electric vehicles right now anyways. So.
I think I just got a Q&A. Oh, okay. Yeah. So Bethany Sam asks, do you think electric cars are truly green, knowing it will take 3 to 4 different mines to make one electric car battery?
Yeah, that's kind of part of what Kanadu talked about as well in terms of the true impact of electric vehicles. That's such a tricky question. I think over the lifetime of an electric vehicle, the benefits of not burning fossil fuels will outweigh the negative impacts of the raw materials that have been mined to make that vehicle. And when you factor into that long-term abilities to recycle things and hopefully eventually develop a circular economy for materials for cars, then the net benefit will be there, but it's still pretty early to tell.
This is probably really obvious, and I'm just not in the car industry. Why is electric vehicle so much heavier?
The battery. So there's a lot of metals in there. There's also the gas tank, like fuel burn, like it exits the vehicle as you use it, and then the battery stays just as heavy as it was when it was fully charged versus depleted. So yeah, that's at least that's what I think. I'm pretty sure that's what.
You mentioned how you would like this to be sort of like kind of being a tool for eventual sort of hearings on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, obviously this was a short presentation, if you've looked at like to what degree this current administration is aware of the issues that you're picking up, both in terms of charging and other issues that you mentioned, in terms of like reskilling, heaviness of batteries, and yeah, will there be like any recommendations in that, and like maybe like make EVs smaller, and that way you both need less lithium and you are dealing with the safety issues or things like that?
Yeah. There are some mentions of the things that I talked about in recent bills that have passed. So for example, the idea of standardizing payments for charging stations is a new standard set by the Federal Highway Administration. But right now they're all just standards. They're like, we should do this, but there's no clear like funding or policy around how to get there. So yeah, so people are thinking about it, but it's not, there isn't a clear path yet.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.